This is TWiT.
Eric Keller, writing in The Messenger, themessenger.com. You could afford the M. Actually, I guess Finkelstein could afford the M. A young congressman sounding alarms about election security. This guy's a freshman member of Congress, Chris DeLuzio from Pennsylvania's 17th District. We often complain, and I know, Brianna, you ran on the premise that our members of Congress don't have a clue about technology.
That's true.
There are a few. Ron Wyden is one, and I guess Chris DeLuzio he was the policy director at the University of Pittsburgh's Institute for Cyber Law Policy and Security, and while there, helped a local commission craft a report that led to, according to Eric, a complete overhaul of voting machines in the area, which is great. He also worked at the NYU's Brennan Center for Justice. Tell us about Chris DeLuzio. We should celebrate when we get some members of Congress who know what they're talking about.
Well, you know, when I cover cybersecurity, and it's such a technical topic, and it can be so dense, and particularly covering it with a focus on policy, you have to make it about the real world impact on regular people. You have to make it something that people can understand without a degree or a CompTIA certification. And I try to make it as much as possible about the people who are involved, particularly, you know, we hear a lot about sort of Washington as this monolith, you know, right. Washington is messing this up or whatever.
Right.
When it comes to tech and cyber, for the most part, these folks really don't have personal experience with this stuff. They're doing what their staffers are telling them, or perhaps they're doing what the lobbyists are telling them. So I try to highlight when folks actually come in with an understanding of this stuff, or in the case of Senator Wyden, you know, they develop an experience with it. Chris DeLuzio is a really interesting person because he's a freshman, so this is his first term in Congress, but he has a lot of experience in a policy context thinking about why it matters that, you know, there are only 4 or 5 companies that make the vast majority of American voting machines, and why there are no federal rules that require them to have any kind of security precautions on these voting machines. This is really all done at the state level, and a state can choose not to require any of this stuff. And it basically comes down to who has the strongest requirements, who has the weakest, not necessarily the way that we would want to set up the system if we started from scratch. He has experience with this. He's studied this. He's looked at this. He's also worked on issues like disinformation and how we can try to get the companies to do things differently. We were talking about this earlier. And what he was saying is basically, you know, he worked with state and local election officials day in and day out as they tried to understand how safe their voting machines were. And what he saw, and this should not surprise folks, is for the most part, these people had no idea how to ask the right questions of these voting machine companies. Do you use two-factor authentication for the administrator portal to get into the unofficial election result database where you post the results on election night? It's not the official results, but if somebody can hack that, they can cause a panic, and potentially in this day and age, that can lead to real world harm, as we've seen riots break out over misinformation on social media. So this is incredibly important. It's all done at the state and local level. The federal government has basically abandoned any sort of responsibility to regulate this. There are agencies that will give advice to the companies about what you should do, but they're not requiring it. They're pushing it to these local election clerks who don't know how to do this stuff. And he actually wrote basically a how-to guide. What questions should you be asking when you're going out there to buy new voting machines? What should you be looking for? And he was talking about how it's time for Washington to step up. It's time for Congress to pass legislation that sort of sets uniform standards so that you don't have to worry whether you live in Massachusetts or California or Idaho. You don't have to worry, is your voting machine producing a paper record so you actually have durable proof of how that vote was cast? You don't have to worry about all kinds of security issues. Right now, you have to kind of figure it out for yourself, look up what kind of equipment you're using and what standards it's meeting. So I think he's an interesting example of somebody who has this prior experience and is coming into this place that is not known for being up on the latest tech and cyber policy news. And he's trying to change that along with, you know, a handful of other folks. So he's someone to watch. You know,
he's a freshman Congress critter, so it's hard, I'm sure, to be heard. Are people paying attention in Congress?
Well, so fortunately for, if you like what he's doing, he sits on the House Armed Services Committee, which writes the policy bill for the Pentagon. And, you know, you would not necessarily guess this, or maybe you would if you follow politics, but a lot of stuff that is not strictly related to the military gets stuffed into this bill. So this committee is very important. Yes. A lot of cybersecurity stuff has been stuffed into the defense bill year over year. Yeah. And so he has the ability to kind of work that angle and get folks paying attention within this committee.
Good. Yeah. He's also trying to slow down the automatic approval, approval of Section 702 of FISA, which would be a good thing as well. That comes up at the end of the year. Go ahead. He's
very interesting because the administration, the Biden administration, is really pushing for that law to be reapproved without major changes. And he comes in this interview with me and basically says, I'm not quite convinced by the argument that the government is making, which is basically the short version is, if we don't renew this law without changes, we're going to lose a really important source of information about cyber attacks in this country. We learn a lot about what the other countries are doing to us in cyberspace by using this power to spy on them. And he basically said, I'm not convinced that this is such a critical tool. So it's an interesting kind of tension between a new Democratic member of Congress and the Democratic president.
In his in this piece, you say he says, we were not thinking about privacy when 702 was created 15 years ago alongside security in the way that we do now. And I think it's appropriate to readdress it and say, how can we make 702 better? If we want to reaffirm it, how do we make it better? I think it's appropriate. Brianna, I'm sure you have a lot to say about this.
Well, I was just going to say, I think it's really interesting in this country. Look, I think no one that looks at election security would claim that we invest the kind of resources into this that we need. At the same time, the fact that, all 50 states and then even, sub-counties within those states all have their own election systems and processes. In some ways, it's so distributed. It does
part of the strength
give faith in it does.
Yeah.
I mean, and you can look at individual circuit clerks' offices, right? And you'll go down there and you'll find Windows ME running, and the infrastructure has not been updated in many years. That's something we should very clearly appropriate more federal dollars for. But I think there are ways to take the strength of states running the elections in a way that makes sense to them, to take that strength and also have some federal guidelines for what kind of technology you can use. I think if there's an argument against public code auditing for voting machines, I have never seen it. I think there's no excuse for this to be a black box. I think, obviously, cybersecurity people should be able to go look at that code and give you confidence in the results. And the issues you're raising, like two-factor authentication for administrator functions, I think that's something we need a mandate for. So I think there's a way to keep the strengths here, but also have a little bit more federal oversight in it in a way that will give the public more confidence in the outcome.
I mean, it's just such an interesting space because a lot of other aspects of technology, PCs and even cars now, they've kind of, the companies have made peace with the idea that there are going to be people tinkering and meddling and trying to find problems. And especially the computer makers decades ago were very, very against the idea of creating programs to let hackers look at the code, look at the technology, tell them if there's a problem, and potentially get a reward for alerting them to a critical flaw. The voting industry is kind of the last bastion of resistance to this idea. And so it's very interesting to watch kind of the resistance from these companies. And they've been opening up a little bit under sustained pressure, including from the government. But a lot of them still don't really feel comfortable letting these hackers, these unvetted hackers, come in and look at this equipment. And for a long time, what they have been able to successfully say is, we're different. We are the architecture of democracy. You cannot let random people look at this code. Now, the response, of course, from the security professionals is they're already doing that. You can buy voting machines on eBay and open them up and see what's in them.
Yeah, they did it at DEF CON last year with the voting machine village.
They did it. I was just there a couple weeks ago watching some of the machines that they were pulling apart. I mean, this stuff is happening already.
Yeah. Although Chris Krebs did say that the 2020 election was the most secure election in U.S. history. He was at the time the director of CISA. He got fired for it. But I mean, I think we'd made progress, have we not?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, a lot of the like state and local government agencies that do this work didn't know that there was any federal support available for them in 2016. And after DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, said, we're going to call elections critical infrastructure, which opens up a new role for us to help them, you started to see local clerks get to know, for example, the cybersecurity agency, CISA, which you just mentioned. They started to form partnerships with FBI cyber experts. You also saw nonprofit groups start to come in, provide money, provide expertise. We have absolutely progressed significantly since 2016. Part of that, of course, was the tech companies for a while felt pressure to do more to fight misinformation and to root out hackers using the platform. So we'll see if that continues to degrade. But absolutely, in a lot of other areas, sometimes it's just as simple as knowing who to call if you see something suspicious on your network. You would be stunned. Folks watching this show would probably be stunned how much that is the problem. You get into a crisis, you've been hacked, you don't know who to call at the federal or state level to get help. That has been dramatically reduced as a problem across the country. That is much, much less of a problem. Those relationships exist today. So we are definitely better off than we used to be.
It's midweek, and you really want to know even more about the world of technology.
So you should check out Tech News Weekly, the show where we talk to and about the people making and breaking the tech news.
It's the biggest news. We talk with the people writing the stories that you're probably reading. We also talk between ourselves about the stories that are getting us even more excited about tech news this week.
So if you're excited, well, then join us. Head to twit.tv/TNW to subscribe.